So my name is Misha. I'm BARC's Forest Watch Assistant. I'm going to be helping to host and moderate this presentation tonight. A little bit about BARC. BARC is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. Since 1999, BARC has organized people from communities around Mount Hood National Forest to keep watch over the ecological conditions of the forest and the actions of the federal agency tasked with managing these public lands, the Forest Service. BARC's 21 years of work is thanks to the many volunteers who've given their time and expertise. Volunteer opportunities include ground truthing proposed timber sales, surveying wetland beaver habitats, comment writing, and working on the Free Mount Hood campaign, which is working to reform Mount Hood National Forest's forest plan. So if you're interested in volunteering with BARC, you can visit our website, which I'll post in the chat, or look at our social media pages, with the handle is at the bottom of this slide, BARC for Mount Hood. We can go to the next slide. So Mount Hood National Forest is one of 119 national forests and grasslands which are owned collectively by the American public through the U.S. federal government and managed by the U.S. Forest Service, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Here's a map of forest lands in the Pacific Northwest. That being said, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. So if we go to the next slide. Is anybody unfamiliar with land acknowledgements? So if you've been to a recent BARC event and you participated in these land acknowledgements, please go grab your journal that you've worked in before so that you can revisit some of your intentions. I'll give a few moments to do that. And if you haven't been to a BARC event and participated in one of these land acknowledgements, go ahead and get something that you can write with. So as an organization founded by white people in the settler colonial lineage, BARC is a part of the land theft and the erasure of Native authority over the lands now referred to as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest. As an organization, we have established influential relationships with the Forest Service, part of the same federal government which facilitated the violent land theft, colonization, and displacement of indigenous peoples. Non-native BARCers have access and privilege to this land because of this violent legacy. We are working to transform our organization to take responsibility for this legacy and these unearned privileges. We are learning to practice acknowledgement, respect, and support for the Molalla, Calapooyans, Chinook and Clackamas, Chinook and Wascos, Northern Paiute peoples, and Sahaptin-speaking peoples who live here and who have always lived here, and the many other Native nations who have always been a part of and cared for this land that we now occupy. I respectfully invite any Native people here today to have a few minutes to speak freely about this. So if you'd like to, feel free to unmute yourself or post in the chat. For all the non-Native people here tonight, I ask you to take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write a note to yourself outlining your intentions to continue this practice of acknowledgement. If you've participated in this before, please try to build on what you have written before, and take this as an opportunity to check in with how you have engaged with those intentions, with those reflections, outside of just these times to practice as well. Okay, so I invite you all to shift away from self-reflection. Go ahead and close your notebooks. And please join me in a moment of silence to express our humble gratitude and apology to the original people here tonight across these lands in the past, the present, and the future. Thank you all for supporting this important practice and learning. Now I'm gonna let Brenna and Courtney introduce themselves and we'll get this workshop started.
Thanks, Misha. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. And keep that notebook handy, keep these reflections handy. I hope you'll be able to build what you were thinking about during this acknowledgement practice into your conversation or our conversation tonight. So I am Courtney Ray. I'm BARC's Associate Director. I have been at BARC for a little over 5 years, and I came on as a community organizer, working really closely with volunteers. And so I still do a lot of coordinating of volunteers. And so if you're interested in working on any of our campaigns, please do get in touch with me or Misha or anybody on staff, really. We're all available to help you get looped in. And I'll be giving the first part of tonight's presentation for Ecology Club. Ecology Club is a monthly event, generally hosted and presented by one of our brilliant volunteers on a subject of their choosing. This month, Brenna and I kind of took over, so staff takeover of Ecology Club. We're going to be talking about the Northwest Forest Plan conceptually as an ecological type of forest management. And I'm going to be starting in a not deep history, but with quite a bit of context. And then I'll be handing it over to Brenna. Brenna, do you want to introduce yourself and say a quick bit about what you'll get into at the second part of the workshop?
Sure. Hi, my name is Brenna Bell, and I'm the staff attorney and policy coordinator for BARC. And like Courtney said, she's going to bring us from, the dawn of time pretty much to when the Northwest Forest Plan was approved. And then I'm going to take it from there on to kind of the present. And I will say, I know this is Ecology Club, but I have to admit I am an attorney and a policy wonk. So a lot of my discussion will be around kind of what happened to the policies of the Northwest Forest Plan and how have they withstood the timber industry pressure since it was passed. So we'll have pretty pictures of ecology, but I'll also be talking a lot about the legal wranglings that have happened to the plan since 1994.
So get ready. There's going to be a lot of information. Feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat. We'll try to feed those in as we go. Ecology Club, in person is a little bit different. It's not so much of a presentation, more of a discussion. So we're going to try to keep things in the spirit of that style of engagement, but we do have a ton of information, so it's going to be a lot of talking. Pardon us. Here we go. So this, I feel like my slide didn't update because I had a funny GIF for you all. This is what we're going to cover, which we've briefly introduced. We're going to start with early American land management and bring it up to where we are today with the Northwest Forest Plan. Oh yeah, this is the slide that I had ready for you. See, I'm thinking way too hard. That's kind of my MO. All right. So are folks familiar with the word Silva or Sylvan? I know there's people named Sylvan. If you're in forestry, you're going to use the word silviculture a lot. And this comes from, it was actually the name of the author of this document, which I believe is 16 something or other, where in Europe, the depletion of the timber in the forest was so extreme that they had begun to look for ways to address their complete and utter loss of usable timber. And so I think it's just very interesting to keep in mind that today when we're talking about forest management, particularly for commodity management, production of the timber crop, we still refer to it in the same way as this original kind of timber famine that was happening in Europe in the colonial era, in the era leading to the imperialist expansion and the settler colonial efforts that came out of many parts of Europe. And that as they looked to solve not only the issue of having used up all their forests, they were also generating all kinds of natural raw material resources and obviously taking on slaves and other, I guess we'll call them human resources for lack of a better word, at that time in order to shore up the European countries who had used up their natural resources. The colonial expansion, as you may remember, was generally funded by European monarchies. And so as goods and materials were taken from elsewhere in the world, It was in service of the crown or in service of this imperialist motivation. And they were further supported by what is called the Doctrine of Discovery. Is that a familiar term? It should be. I certainly learned it in about 6th or 7th grade. The Doctrine of Discovery is a Catholic Christian doctrine that was basically gave any Christian European force or nation complete right to dominate any non-Christian, non-European peoples anywhere and to take and have all their resources. And so buoyed by the Doctrine of Discovery, buoyed by these imperialistic monarchies and facing their own natural resource depletion, Europe launched itself all over the world in order to take everything it wanted. By the American Revolution, many of those same ideas are still in play. The Doctrine of Discovery, the idea of providence, that the settlers, the colonists from Europe were, being carried forward in time by the providence of God, and additionally had, the rights to everything that lay before them, and were empowered in this kind of spiritual way to dominate everything. One interesting piece of information that I think is kind of telling is that one of the reasons, not that there were many reasons for the American Revolution, but one of the reasons was that the King of England had forbade the colonists from going, I think, east of, I forget what the longitude was, but it was not far east of the Appalachian Mountains, because they did not want any further controversy, any further battles with the native tribes. And the colonists were incensed that they would be told that they couldn't continue to spread and take over more. And so one of the reasons that they wanted their independence from Britain was so that they could continue the westward expansion. And so we know how that played out, first with the Northwest Territory, which is, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, that area, then with the Louisiana Purchase, then with the Mexican-American War, which got all of that Southwest Territory, and then the Oregon Territory came after that. So through this westward expansion time, and the reason I'm pulling so many visuals into this presentation is because I think that the way that these philosophies of what land is for, who has the right to it, how it should be used, what is good land and what is wasteland, all of these things are really deeply embedded in our modern American land management ideas. They haven't like vanished, they have just evolved and melded into new and different things. And so manifest destiny is an idea, a concept that comes into play in the 1800s, mid 1800s, around the same time that folks like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau come on the scene. And they're basically combining these new American identities of, the right to the land, the awesomeness of the land and God's providence in giving the settlers this land, the supremacy, of the expansion and this mission that the settlers are on in Manifest Destiny. This comes with political mechanisms as well, the Homestead Act, the Indian Removal Act, things like the Gold Rush, the Transcontinental Railroad. These things all come as tangible pieces of these bigger ideas, these deeper and even spiritual ideas that the new Americans, as they kind of forge an identity separate from Europe, use in order to empower the country to develop, empower them to become economically powerful. And the other side of all of this is that they crushed everything in their wake. They crushed the people in their wake. They took of the resources. And so while we've all been educated about the westward expansion in the 1800s as a very proud time in the nation's history, where things were established and riches were gained, and people were, populated the wastelands and changed the land so that they were actually useful and not just, barren and unused lands as they were seen at that time. That was the mentality, and there's still a lot of pride in these ideas. And you'll see it not only in our land management philosophies, but in our environmental philosophies and our conservation philosophies. Toward the end of the 1800s, reality is starting to hit. They are worried about a timber famine. They passed laws like the Timber Culture Act, which encouraged tree planting because so much logging had occurred. The exploitation of Chinese labor and of slave labor to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and the subsequent felling of all the resources, mining of all the resources, hunting of all the resources that came with this massive expansion, put the nation, the people and the government on alert. And as they get toward the end of the 18th century or the 1800s, they start to be a little bit more, try to be conscientious about their consumption, while at the same time continuing to consume and expand. And toward the end is where you see things like the protection of the national parks, the first national parks, the emergence of these professional naturalists and ecologists who are documenting all of the wildlife and plant life as the westward expansion is happening, and starting to recognize the impact that the colonial effort is having on the landscape and the loss of so many resources. Thoreau and others are romanticizing this naturalism. They're really making it spiritual, and they're speaking in that same tone that Emerson first started, which is self-reliance, individuality, and the spiritual nature of nature. Those are all things very, very familiar to us today in our ethic that is in the mainstream environmental ethic. But these things are playing together in a very different way in the 1800s, as they're continuing to leverage the values that the white settlers have for their own favor, and to the expense of indigenous communities. The Dawes Act in the late, I think, 1880s basically said that even reservation communities were to be broken up, and they were to be forced to live as individual properties the way that the settlers had. The national parks were created in some of the areas that had been reserved for Native folks at the time, because folks like John Muir wanted special places to be kept aside for white people. They also started to look at their resource consumption and try to get strategic about reserving timber in particular, and setting aside forest reserves, which eventually became national forests. And so these first kind of scientific, strategic, organized kinds of land management ideas, they come into play after the westward expansion has demonstrated how incredibly destructive, like unregulated consumption, the unregulated consumption of the settlement process had been. Now we're into the 1900s. Things are getting a little bit more concrete. The Forest Service and the National Park Service have been established. They have very different goals. The Forest Service is a conservation organization, and so how can we thoughtfully, conservatively use resources and take resources without overusing them? and the National Park Service in a preservation mindset, as in we're not going to touch this. We're going to try to keep this in its exact state that it currently is. We like it this way. We don't want it to change. And both of those administered by the federal government, obviously, on behalf of the American public, who was at that time certainly did not include any kind of meaningful representation for Native Americans. It's also the era of Jim Crow. Black people are largely excluded from places like national parks, in state parks and city parks and everywhere else. And then after the First World War, there was a timber famine because so much wood had been used to support the war effort that they had, they were in kind of a timber shock again. And so that was the beginning of, I would call the modern round of conservation, a bigger conservation laws for natural resources. Then there was a Second World War. But after the Second World War, people are feeling pretty confident. There's a huge boom, and the timber resources get completely wiped out, basically, as the housing boom happens. And also people in their new victory, you know, fresh off of a victory, they get very excited about their American culture and their recreation culture. And so these competing pressures of meeting the needs of the housing boom post-war, and then this cultural revival of recreation, and many people had higher incomes and opportunity. White people had opportunity to have recreation as a bigger part of their life and in their family culture. And we kind of know there are very many iconic kind of summer family camping mythos, you know, from starting from the 50s and 60s is when that really gets this aesthetic thing that you can see in American culture. Ansel Adams' work becomes really important and popular to people then, as he's documenting the last empty places that have been reserved for this kind of pristine and alone sort of recreation, lands that had been native lands. And so with all of these competing pressures, the Forest Service and, you know, many other agencies, but in particular the Forest Service, starts trying to figure out how to manage the lands, not just for the resources, but for these other competing values, recreation in particular, and the protection or the drinking water sources. And so this is when this concept of multiple use, which you'll hear a lot, comes into play, and they passed the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in the 60s. And this is kind of the culmination of this round of competing interests on what the land is for, who's going to have access, how the government is going to provide that these different values and different resources are delivered to the public, the public who has the right to them. By the 70s, things are getting even more heated. There's been, you know, extreme disruption to natural systems since the Industrial Revolution. There are rivers on fire. They've started to name species as endangered of extinction. Some of the early ones, the manatee, the whooping crane, and others. There's pollution. There's, you know, deforestation has already been on people's minds, but really the environmental world is coming to a head. And in the Nixon years, they pass a bunch of environmental laws that are the most substantive that we have to this day in many ways. The Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air and Water Act, National Forest Management Act, a bunch of other ones. You would learn those in Brenna's other workshops. And at that time as well, science is starting to explore ecology and ecosystems in this more holistic way, seeing the interconnectivity between species, the relationships of species to their ecosystems, and vice versa. And so as these things all kind of start combining together, all these factors, these influences, and these pressures, including here in the Pacific West, the rapid logging of what's left of the old growth forest, all kind of culminates in the late 70s and the 80s with this critter called the spotted owl. And it's a famous, it's just as famous, it's almost as famous as any animal in this country for sure, because when it was being studied by researchers at the Oregon State University, they discovered a really strong link between the spotted owl and old growth forest, which was rapidly disappearing under the Forest Service's multiple use sustained yield practice. And so the Forest Service, academia were aware of this, and they were looking for ways to stop the owl from going extinct and studying, you know, how those ecosystems could be managed in a way that would not cause the owl to go extinct. And over the course of the 80s, all of this strife about what to do about the owl. Some folks are trying to get it listed as an endangered species on the national federal endangered species list. It does exist on the state of Oregon's endangered species list. It's, you know, people are taking to the trees to protect it. There's all kinds of rallies going on. There's science, you know, this conservation-based science, and getting this detailed information about the conditions that the owl needs and the status of its populations. And all of these things are just becoming like, they're getting put under a microscope. And so the owl kind of brings everything into this focus where the public, the agencies, the government, the academic and scientific world all kind of see the owl as representing these various competing interests. And it got very heated, as many of you may know, as you can see from some of these cartoons and things. And not only that, there was violence. You know, people were harmed, nearly killed, in between trying to protect these last stands of old growth and trying to keep the timber industry going. And this was such an intense situation that by the early 90s, the federal government, the president, stepped in to kind of put an end to the timber wars. It was called the Timber Wars. And to try and please, again, both or all the different values, to try to please the environmental community and stop the owl going extinct, and to try to please the industry and make sure that logging could continue. There was a very, very big dramatic lawsuit in 1991, I believe, 1990, that because the Forest Service did not have a sufficient plan in place to protect the owl, the judge ordered a stop on all logging in the Pacific Northwest until the Forest Service could come up with a plan that would be viable for the protection of the owl. And that was maybe the biggest, I don't know, maybe Brenna, you can give a description of the biggest act the judicial system had taken on behalf of any single ecological critter or any facet of the non-human world in our country, I think, at that time. And that injunction that stopped all the logging set the wheels in motion for the Northwest Forest Plan, because everything was so intense and everyone was so incensed. The president called a summit in Portland, and I think over the course of a year or two, incorporating all of these new scientific concepts, incorporating these ideals of what the land should be used for the public, the propping up of the economy for the nation, for the success of the nation's economy. That has, been an old idea. And the idea that the management of the lands would be based on the species and that species' relationship to the larger ecosystem, this ecological conservation or ecological forestry concept. So where the owl is, we're going to look at how we can treat the larger ecosystem in order to support the owl, and thinking that that will also protect many other species.
So Leah asked, do you think there is still a camping culture to the same extent?
Camping, like this recreation culture? Certainly, yes.
Just wondering if that was like a particularly big camping heyday.
I think it was a very big camping heyday because it was in this post-war atmosphere. And people, and also people were kind of, white middle class people were better off than they had ever been. And so this leisure lifestyle, the opportunity to have a life with more leisure combined with this deep Emersonian, I'm going to try to get to Barbara's question too, but you know, the relative wealth of the white middle class and this long, deep romanticization of nature that starts with Emerson and the American identity related to this broad land that is ours, that is, you know, the gift of gods, and that is so beautiful. I think those two things combined post World War II to be like the recreation, the seeding of this recreation culture that we have in the country today. It doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not as simple as you may think. Regarding manifest destiny, I think, you know, Emerson's work happened at the same time as, and I forget the name of the guy who coined the term manifest destiny, but it was in 1840 something. So it was about the same time that Emerson started becoming, you know, nationally known, and they just play very well together, right? Like, I don't know that Emerson has a direct influence or a direct like contribution to that concept of manifest destiny, but the idea that God is nature and humans are best when they are self-reliant and independent and communing with nature goes really well with God said we can have this whole continent, and we are destined to reach the West, and we are destined to take all of its riches. Like, those things pair very nicely together. And so like that just becomes a very like deep emotional, spiritual, political identity for America, which at this point has only been its own country for, you know, 50 years or something. So there's still a lot of, what does it mean to be American? And so this rugged individual explorer communing with nature type is the result of the Emerson plus the manifest destiny. And that those, obviously there was many people besides Emerson. Some of this artwork in the earlier slide is like these glorious vistas with these beautiful sun, you know, these are kind of indicative of that time period too. This transcendental or romantic imagery is very popular, and it's helping the settlers to see themselves as Americans, to be uniting around these kinds of aesthetic and spiritual and philosophical ideas. This other picture is called Manifest Destiny, with this angel person. And if you look closely, that angel is stringing out behind them the electric utility lines. The train is coming. The native people and the wild animals are running in fear away from the settlers and the hunters, the trappers. So and they're, you know, the angel is an angel holding a Bible. It's glorious white woman. You know, this was an image that really got everybody going back in that time. So I just think that that's how much of our modern understanding, our modern the way that we identify with nature and with the outdoors is coming from all these things. We are inheriting the predecessors of these ideas and of these values. And to keep that in mind when we talk about what do we want to do with land, how do we want to manage it, what do we want to protect, and what do we want to use, who do we want to use it, how do we want to change it. We maybe haven't reckoned with some of this deep underlying assumption and philosophy that's really evident. And when you look at the 18th century, but then when you look at, or the 1800s, but when you look at the 1900s, it looks a lot more practical and a lot more scientific and a lot more informed. But it may be, not that different actually from, that's kind of my argument, is it may not be that different from the ideals and the motivations of the expansion period and generally the white settler colonial worldview. Besides spotted owl, are there other? Yes. Okay, yeah, Brenna's going to get to that one. Are there any other questions for me, or we can get into the Brenna part?
Samantha asked, I'd like to know more about the relationship between lumber harvesting companies and government/public lands. What historically has been the pitched benefit of allowing, benefits in quotes, of allowing lumber companies to make so much money from publicly owned resources?
Well, so they weren't publicly owned until the later 1800s. In this cartoon here, you have Teddy Roosevelt with his newly established public lands that they had just started to kind of mark things out as public and under the management of the federal government in the later 1800s. Up until then, the private industry had been, at private individuals and private industry was it was open. They were literally giving land away that wasn't theirs to give away. The government was giving land away, giving native land away that wasn't theirs to give in order to populate the West. They wanted, manifest destiny again. They wanted to get to the West. They wanted to get to the West Coast, and so they were making it easier. They're incentivizing private and individual, conquest and settlement and business interests. Then it became public when it turned out that they thought too much was being taken. So they quickly tried to reserve what was still there. And then to manage it conservatively. This is where the word conservation comes from, is not to just take everything, with no regulation, but to take what you need in a regulated way. That's like the original idea of the conservation movement. And the preservation movement, meaning don't take anything from this. So hopefully that, and then the benefit is, I think the benefit today of having private companies taking from public resources is that those companies, those are companies that people work for in our nation. They're private, but they are companies that are part of the larger economy. And to some degree, the government feels responsible for making sure that those industries can function so that we, the people, have the stuff that those companies are creating. So hopefully that kind of gets to that question.
Do we have time for one more, or do we want to move on?
Yeah, let's do this last one.
Okay. Is it possible to legally reframe the idea of land and resource protection to an idea of ecosystem protection?
I think that is what the Northwest Forest Plan wants to do in some ways. It's certainly what the conservation biology and the ecological, like ecocentric kind of environmentalist and scientific philosophies want to do. Anything's possible legally. You can make anything a law. You just have to get people to agree to it and then punish the people who won't. So yes, but I have more questions around that. So like hold on to that idea there and the implications of that idea. And let's like get into Brenna's, and she can talk specifically about how the Northwest Forest Plan tries to it doesn't divorce itself completely from this history, but it tries to give some more legs to this ecosystem and ecological concept. Thanks for your questions.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Courtney. That was awesome. In my forest law and policy crash course, I go into history, but not that deep and that thorough. I think it's really important to understand how we got here and how those pieces of philosophy that we might find repugnant today are still very much underlying the ideas that we are bringing forward. So thanks for that. We're going to talk about the Northwest Forest Plan, pick up where Courtney left off in 1994, and talk about, did anybody actually win the timber wars? What does it look like? And as I said before, I am a lawyer, so sometimes my bent goes towards talking about the way the policy and law are structuring things. So we'll focus on that. But before I start, I want to take a moment to remember really a giant in Oregon's history. George Atiyeh was not at the forefront of the Northwest Forest Plan wars because he wasn't a policy guy. He was a person of the land. And I'm going to get you choked up. The land he loved was Opal Creek. And George spent his life fighting for Opal Creek and is the main reason that Opal Creek is a protected area and was foundational in getting the education center going. And he just passed away in the fire up there. So it felt important to me to remember him. If we're talking about the timber wars, all the different people, the individuals who have given their lives work to protecting places and falling in love with them and making them better for everyone. And so he died in the forest that he loved while it was undergoing a great transition. And I just wanted to bring him into this and know that we need to carry the spirit of those with us as we move forward. So George Atiyeh Presente. Okay, with that, let's get into the nitty gritty. We're talking about forest plans. And as many of you know, because Bark has been talking about forest plans for a very long time, each national forest has a plan. That National Forest Management Act that Courtney mentioned, one of the main things it did was get every forest to write a plan, and in that plan, designate every acre of the forest as, with specific land designations, what the highest and best use of that part of the land was, and then also create standards and guidelines for what you could do on that land. So every national forest had a plan, and all those plans were different. There were some standards that they had to meet, but there was no regional framework that ensured that between the different national forests, the standards and guidelines would be the same. So one of the just transformational things the Northwest Forest Plan did was it looked at this entire region like as one area, and it's the range of the northern spotted owl, right? As Courtney said, the controversy of the owl sparked the plan, and it went above and beyond the owl, but the range of the owl was the main determiner of what land was included in the Northwest Forest Plan. And so for the first time, the national forests all shared some management guidelines, because what the Northwest Forest Plan did was amend those underlying forest plans. It's like the Mountain Hood National Forest Plan was adopted in 1990. So then in 94, when the Northwest Forest Plan came out, it amended that plan. And if there was anything that was it conflicted between the two plans, the Northwest Forest Plan trumped unless the underlying plan was more protective. So what we got was this framework that was working to create more consistent ecosystem-focused management throughout the entire Northwest ecosystem. And you can see it goes from Canada down almost to San Francisco. That's the range of the northern spotted owl. I think it's 19 national forests. Here's the Northwest Forest Plan area. What I said will make more sense seeing this map. So I'll just take a second and you can see this map. See how it goes up from Canada all the way down to San Francisco and this different physiographic provinces that make up the area that is now covered by the Northwest Forest Plan. And I will just say as an aside, we're not going to get into it really, but the BLM has since jettisoned its way out of the Northwest Forest Plan. But at the time, it was a huge deal for both the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service to share management guidelines. They had never done that before, even though the BLM manages a lot of Western Oregon, especially Southwestern Oregon. That's a much more complicated story. So we're gonna just focus on the Forest Service for ease. All right, I'm going to go through the major components of what the forest plan does. I've got a lot of words, but I wanted to give you a pretty picture. So it laid out kind of 4 major components, and the first is the reserve system. So this is seen as really the heart of the Northwest Forest Plan. It is created in a network of reserves that are widely distributed throughout the whole area. There's 2 types of main reserves. One are called late successional reserves, and the other are riparian reserves. And the name late successional reserve is slightly misleading. It makes one think that all the land that was late successional got reserved, got set aside from logging or industrial practices. And just to get out of silvicultural jargon, you could also call them mature or old growth forests. Late successional characteristics start to develop around 80 years of age in a forest. But that's not exactly why these lands were protected. Some of them were late successional, but the map didn't map out directly onto late successional forests. Some of them were not, with the idea that they will become late successional. And all in all, there's about 7.5 million acres of a Northwest Forest Plan area that are part of these LSRs. And the Northwest Forest Plan language says, the objective of late successional reserves is to protect and enhance conditions of late successional and old growth forest ecosystems, which serve as habitat for late successional and old growth related species, including the northern spotted owl. So the idea was that these lands would be managed primarily for habitat conservation for late successional and old growth species. That's 7.5 million acres. Then there are also the riparian reserves. Now, I'll get into riparian reserves a little bit more when I'm talking about water very soon, but that's about 2.5 million acres of area. The easiest way to understand it is the area on either side of a stream that gets protected for that stream. So those networks interacted together. About 40% of late successional reserves are also riparian reserves. And that was supposed to provide this network that would help late successional species navigate through the ecosystem because there was enough room for them to go. I notice there's a lot of chat activity, so I'm going to stop and see if there's questions. Oh,
it's just me. I'm annotating for you.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. And so that was reserves. The next major component of the Northwest Forest Plan was called survey and manage. And honestly, this is one of my favorite because it is, to answer a question that came up earlier, it focuses on all these really obscure different plants. I'm going to read you the list because I don't want to miss anything. It was some 400 species of amphibians, bryophytes, fungi, lichens, mollusks, vascular plants, arthropod functional groups, and 1 mammal. And we're going to talk about that mammal in a little bit. But it was all these things, a lot of them are little things, rare things that lived in late successional forests that there wasn't a lot of information on. And people were afraid might lose out their habitat if they were not surveyed for. So you can imagine that the reserves create kind of this coarse filter over the landscape to protect large scale habitat. And then the survey and manage program was a very fine filter. You actually had to go in, if you were going to do some kind of ground disturbing project, typically outside of the reserves, you had to go in with a fine tooth comb and look for all these different species. And if you found them, protect them. It often meant buffers. The plant that I'm showing here is called Cypripedium montanum. It's a mountain lady slipper. It's one of the survey and managed species that Barkers found while we were surveying in the crystal clear restoration area. I know when we were out there, we also, I think Leah, who's on this, also found a type of mushroom, Albatrellus fleti. I hope I said that right, which is another survey and managed species. And every time we find these, it results in acres being dropped and species being protected. We also found a lot of candy stick in the North Clacksale. So survey and manage, it slowed things down. It created an enormous amount of jobs in the forest, which was really exciting. A lot of my friends during the heyday of survey and manage were seasonal surveyors. And it changed the way that the Forest Service managed, because all of a sudden they were not just looking for the large charismatic mega fauna like the spotted owls, but they're looking for rare lichens and bryophytes as well. Because that was the next major component of the Northwest Forest Plan. And then we get to the aquatic conservation strategy. Like I said, the owl was the catalyst, but thankfully, the people who got together and created the Northwest Forest Plan expanded far beyond the owl and really brought in a lot of discussion about riparian ecosystems, water resources, things like that. Then the salmon had not yet been listed as threatened when the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted. But people knew that they were in decline and used this opportunity to create a whole system of protections for riparian areas. And the aquatic conservation strategy had 4 main components. The riparian reserves, like I've mentioned, which is lands along streams or unstable or potentially unstable areas. And on fish-bearing streams, those riparian areas were about 300 feet on both sides, about 600 feet total. And on non-fish-bearing streams, it was about 300 feet total that had to be managed to meet the aquatic conservation strategy objectives. And so that is one aspect, is actual reserved land. Another is the designation of key watersheds, watersheds that were seen as important to maintaining water health, usually for salmon. And then there were watershed analyses, and these had to be done for every single major watershed in the National Forest System. And it was a huge undertaking by the agency. They were mostly written between 1996 and 1998. And we still use them all the time at BARC. I'm forever pulling out the watershed analyses. They're some of the most comprehensive, detailed reports on each watershed in the national forests that exist. And they were written with care by a lot of specialists with local knowledge, and they're incredibly helpful. They set out recommendations to follow for all future management. That was another part of the aquatic conservation strategy. And the last was a program of watershed restoration that has not moved, I think, as much as many would have liked, because there were no action foreseen components. But in the ideal, in the Northwest Forest Plan, it was a comprehensive long-term program of watershed restoration and to restore this health, including the habitat supporting fish and other aquatic and riparian dependent organisms. So altogether, those 4 things make up the aquatic conservation strategy, which again was great because they really didn't have to do that to meet the initial issue of, we got to get something to lift this injunction so we can log again. But they did, and we still have it.
Hey, Brenna.
Yes?
Could you say the 4 again?
The 4 again were riparian reserves, watersheds, watershed analysis, and watershed restoration.
Okay.
And then the last part of the Northwest Forest Plan was the designation of the matrix. And the matrix is all the land that's not otherwise protected by the Northwest Forest Plan was designated as matrix. It's about 4 million acres. And the idea was that most timber harvest and other silvicultural activities would be conducted in the matrix, and they are. Even though they're kind of spreading into the reserves, as we'll get into in a moment. And contrary to popular mythology, The Northwest Forest Plan neither outlawed clear cutting nor outlawed old growth logging. And people often say it did, in part because there was a massive drawback. The Forest Service and even the BLM for a moment thought that it was better if they focused on logging in plantations, especially thinning in plantations. And that happened for the bulk of the time after the Northwest Forest Plan, not because the Northwest Forest Plan required it, but because political sentiment was so anti-logging for a while. That also is changing. And now the Forest Service is once again planning old growth timber sales and clear cutting on matrix lands under the Northwest Forest Plan. So those were the major elements of the Northwest Forest Plan, and we're going to circle back to them and see how they've fared through history. But before we get there, we've got to get through 1995. And 1995 was a key moment because it was a massive betrayal and resistance that happened. And I'm going to put up a picture of one of BARC's former executive directors in a tree sit. What happened in 1995 and why Sandy is in a tree was called the salvage rider. And so it's the very year after the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted, the very year after President Clinton and Al Gore came to Portland to the Timber Summit and said, we are going to solve the timber wars for good. We are going to stop all these fights. We're going to clear things up. So they did that. And then bowing to pressure, primarily from senators from Washington and Oregon, I think in a large part because they hated the Northwest Forest Plan, Congress passed and Clinton signed the salvage rider. It was attached to the Rescissions Act that included disaster relief funds for victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, as well as flood victims in California. It was basically a must-pass bill that had this little backpack on it that was the rider. And what the salvage rider did was exempt all timber sales in national forests, including those covered by the Northwest Forest Plan, from public challenges under environmental laws if the forest was deemed to be imminently susceptible to fire and disease attack, which is all the forests. And so this led to just mayhem and another series of battles in the timber wars. And this is particularly close to my heart because it's how I got involved in forest defense in 1997. There were protests and tree sits and direct actions all up and down the West Coast. And those days, I mean, some of them are just legendary, like Warner Creek, Fall Creek. I was involved in Mountain Hood National Forest from 1997 to 2002. We were trying to stop the Eagle Creek timber sale. This picture actually has me slightly unrecognizable because I'm in my hairy phase. There with the claw vase in the middle is a very young Brenna protesting in front of the Forest Service building in downtown Portland. Thousands and thousands of people poured out. And the political pressure was so great that a lot of these timber sales actually got stopped by Congress, including the Eagle Creek timber sale. So after 7 years of protesting, we were able to save about 2/3 of the sale. But think about it in the context of the Northwest Forest Plan, right? It seemed like the timber wars, if not won, were at least been neutralized, had a negotiated end. And all of a sudden, all of these timber sales got pushed through. It only had a 2-year window, but once the sale got through that window, then there was just this huge long battle to fight to stop them. So that reinvigorated the timber wars, created a lot of new activists. Many of us are still engaged. We populate a lot of the nonprofits who were working on this. Because in many cases we won, and we really saw the importance of public participation and the importance of the ability to enforce the laws or take to the trees. So the salvage rider happened. All of those fights happened. The legacy is vast, and if you're interested, there's a lot of great reporting on it that talk about the legacy of that time. But we're going to get back to the Northwest Forest Plan, find out, okay, after the salvage rider kind of died down, and the law of the land once again was the Northwest Forest Plan, and the Forest Service's hands were tied, they were bound to following it. What happened? Well, they tried to dismantle it, is what happened. So we'll start with how they tried to dismantle survey and manage, which is honestly pretty long and complex. So you can see the timeline stretches from 2001 to 2014. So in 2001, the Forest Service and BLM reduced the number of species on the list to 337 and did some other administrative changes to make it so that they didn't have to survey everything beforehand. So that was the first issue. And let me flip my notes. So that happened. People were like, okay, we can live with this, the reduction to 337. We didn't love it, but at least survey management is still on the books. But that wasn't good enough for the agencies. So they came back in 2004 and said, we're kidding. We're actually just getting rid of the entire program. So there was a lawsuit, went to court. The court said, no, you can't. That was a foundational part of the Northwest Forest Plan. It has to stay. So we went, back to the Forest Service and the BLM. Seems like they didn't learn much, because in 2007, they came back with another attempt to remove the survey and manage requirements for the Northwest Forest Plan. So we went back to court. And again, the court blocked the government from getting rid of survey and manage. And then it just got like crazy in terms of the legality. The BLM, strangely, has a wonderful website where they go through all of the legal wranglings, but it involved a lawsuit and a settlement, and then the timber industry not liking the settlement and taking it back to court, and then the court being like, yes, we don't like the settlement either, so it had to go back, and it just went up and down through the layers of court. So we get to 2014, and in 2014, there's like finally some agreement on what is still part of survey and manage program. So where we ended up now is the 2001 list. So it still has 337 survey and managed species, even though a few of them have been reduced since then, based on finding that they're more common than originally thought. And there's an exemption where the Forest Service no longer has to survey if it focuses on forested stands younger than 80 years old. And again, there's that 80 years old number. And the reason why that is because it's at 80 that our forests start to show or what's the word I have? Acquiring older forest characteristics, kind of depending on site productivity and disturbance, but 80 is about that moment where they move into late successional potential. So where we're at with survey and manage now is before a ground disturbing project in forest stands over 80 years old, the Forest Service has to survey for any of those species that are reasonably likely to be in the area. And if they find them, they have to protect them. So after all of that legal mayhem, I wanted to give you this. This is that one mammal who is on the survey and manage list. It also might be one of the darlingest little mammals out there. It's called the red tree vole. And if you've been around Bark, you might have even received emails from red tree voles. They had a lot to say about the North Clack sale. And I want to use that as an example to talk about how survey and manage works today on the ground. So red tree voles spend their entire lives in the canopy of trees. They're a totally arboreal rodent, and they are also one of the main food sources of the northern spotted owl, which is why they are on survey and manage list. And the Forest Service surveys for them, but not always very thoroughly. So they're, we didn't think there were a lot in Mount Hood National Forest, but when they were up getting when the Forest Service was planning the North Clack timber sale, they sent climbers up to survey for voles, and they found a few voles. And that was it. I think they found 3. And they said, oh, there are some voles, we'll protect them. Each vole site gets 10 acres of protection. So it's fairly big protection. But there is a group of volunteers called the Northwest Ecosystem Survey Team, or NEST, who knows that the Forest Service isn't very diligent on their surveys. And so they go in and they follow and they look for tree vole nests. And Bark talked to them, and they came up and they trained some Bark volunteers, and Barkers and nesters climbed a whole lot of trees and found a whole lot of voles. I think almost upwards of 100 vole nests. And the Forest Service was a little ashamed and went back. They sent their claimers back to verify the findings and concluded that yes, they had grossly misunderestimated the, that's a Bushism. They had underestimated the number of voles out there. So now with North Clack, 411 acres were protected, which is awesome. But what's not awesome is that there are known vole nests, trees, old growth trees with voles in them that are not going to be protected at North Clack. And that's because of that exemption that I mentioned earlier. Remember how I said that the survey and manage rules only apply to forested stands over 80 years old? Well, the Forest Service has interpreted that to mean that if there is a tree that is over 80 years old, or a few trees maybe, but the forested stand is not, they do not have to protect survey and manage species in those remnant trees, even if they are known to exist. And unfortunately, the courts bought that argument. And so there are some vole nests, some trees with voles in them that are still on the chopping block because the Forest Service pretty much does anything it can to limit the amount of protection it needs to give the species. That's their attempts to dismantle survey and manage. The upside as well is that it's still a program, but it only applies to forested stands older than 80 years.
Brenda, quick question. Does BLM have to do survey and manage, or are they
Nope.
exempt? No.
BLM seceded from the Northwest Forest Plan a couple years ago.
Okay. And then Rebecca asked, did the 4 million acres of designated matrix land include BLM lands, or is that just USFF?
Yeah.
Yeah,
all the numbers are from the plan itself, the original plan, when the BLM was still a part of it. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Those are all the questions.
Brenna, can you tell us how the BLM seceded?
Oh my gosh, it's such a long story. The main way is they're just like, we're out. I mean, it's still under litigation. Like, people are still fighting this. But a lot of it has to do with an obscure act called the Oregon and California Lands Act that the BLM has long insisted makes their land timber dominant, and that the only thing they can do is maximize timber harvest on it. And so they have used that argument to push back on every type of protective legislation or regulation. And they were under the Northwest Forest Plan for a while, but eventually like wiggled their way out. So the BLM is an odd bird, and even the fact that they have, Oregon is the only place in the entire country where they manage forests, and they do it poorly. So, but that's a very long and winding tale. But I'll get back to all the ways the BLM and the Forest Service are trying to dismantle the existing Northwest Forest Plan rather than just getting themselves out of it. So they tried to do that to survey and manage. Next, they tried to dismantle the aquatic conservation strategy. And like I said, the salmon were not listed as threatened when the Northwest Forest Plan was written, but did become listed soon after. And the agencies basically said, we will implement the aquatic conservation strategy. And that is our recovery plan for the threatened salmon. Because once a species is listed as threatened, it needs to have a recovery plan. They based theirs on compliance with the aquatic conservation strategy. So how the agency interpreted the aquatic conservation strategy became very important in terms of salmon management and recovery, right? Now, a lot of these attempts to dismantle happened during George W. Bush's administration, the ACS and also the survey and manage. So what happened, and I like this story. Bush was an interesting opponent, his administration. They were not kind to forests and regulations. What happened was this. So the Forest Service and the BLM started saying, well, yes, we have to comply with the aquatic conservation strategy, but we only have to do it at the landscape level. So if we are damaging water quality at the project level, that's fine. We just have to scale up to a scale that's big enough that we dilute the impacts, and we're saying, oh, it's all good, right? That was a paraphrase of their approach. And the fishermen sued and won. They sued the National Forest Manage or the National Marine Fisheries Service, NIMFS, and the Forest Service for relying on that like scaled up view, and said, no, the aquatic conservation strategy says you have to meet the objectives at the project level and the landscape level. And the court agreed. The court said, yes, you have to do it at the site specific level. That's the case that I have up there. And then the Bush administration said, okay, well, what actually happened was the Northwest Forest Plan was written incorrectly. Like the language of the plan isn't right. So we are going to amend it to clarify that what we really meant was you just have to look at it at the landscape level. And they sent out this survey to all of the scientists who had been part of the Forest Ecosystem Management Team, the FEMAT, that wrote the Northwest Forest Plan. And they said, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're right? This is what you meant. And the scientists were like, no, that's not what we meant. We meant at the project level, at the site-specific level, you need to meet the aquatic conservation strategy. And so then the Bush administration, not very bright, said, okay, well, we're just going to do it anyway. But they had created this record of all the scientists saying that that's not what they meant. And so again, it went to court, and the court said, are you kidding me? The scientists all said this is not a clarification, that the original intent of the ACS was to protect things at a site-specific level, not just a landscape. And I hope this isn't too legally wonky. I think this stuff is fascinating, because what it means is you can't just rely on scaling up your analysis to the point where the impacts no longer look adverse. And as long as the Forest Service has the option to scale up their analysis, they're going to do that. So luckily, that attempt by the Bush administration to make it so that project level compliance with moot is gone. And the aquatic conservation strategy as written is still what is in the Northwest Forest Plan. So there's all these fantastic standards that the agency still doesn't love to follow, but they are there in the books. So the next thing they wanted to do is expand logging in reserves for forest and riparian restoration. These are the specifics from the Northwest Forest Plan, what can and can't happen. In the late successional reserves, you can see it says there is no harvest allowed in stands over 80 years. However, thinning, including commercial thinning, can occur in stands up to 80 years old, regardless of the origin of the stands. And that's important because it means that both planted plantations and naturally regrown, usually fire-originated stands can all be thinned for forest health. East of the Cascades and south, there's even more leniency towards logging because they're more prone to fire and disease. So that's logging in reserves. And this is in the original plan, but it kind of has expanded beyond even that. And there is part in the Northwest Forest Plan that says prohibit timber harvest in riparian reserves unless it's really necessary, basically. They're like, unless you need to. And you can need to for a lot of reasons. You can need to salvage log in riparian reserves to meet aquatic conservation objectives. You can need to, if you look at C, apply silvicultural practices to control stalking, because the Forest Service often likes to talk about how the fact that there's too many trees. So it can go in there and thin. Now this is a big issue because we live in an era where the Forest Service is branding all of their logging now as forest restoration. All of it is for forest health. All of it is to restore ecosystems. And BARC ran into this most head-on with our fight against the jazz timber sale several years ago. It was about a 2,000 acre timber sale in a key watershed. It was highly unstable geologically. And it was almost entirely logging in riparian reserves and late successional reserves. And we're like, really? And the Forest Service is like, yeah. And we pushed them on it. We went to court on it, especially compliance with the aquatic conservation strategy, because they were logging so many trees from the riparian reserves. They were creating this long deficit of dead trees in the future. And dead trees are incredibly important to riparian health. And unfortunately, the courts agreed. They're like, hey, the Forest Service says it's forest health, and we defer to their interpretation of their own work. And so they can go forward and do all this reserve logging. And we still see that. We're still fighting projects where there's massive logging programs in the reserves. So they haven't changed the language in the Northwest Forest Plan, but they have changed their own branding of the plans or of their timber, like the impact of their timber, to make it sound like they're the champions of the forest. Okay, so that is all the ways that they're trying to get around, dismantle, diminish the Northwest Forest Plan. So I do want to talk a little bit about if any good things happen from the Northwest Forest Plan. As I was writing this, I was like, oh, I'm really focusing on all the ways that the Forest Service and the BLM trying to get out of it. But there are some good things. And I want to leave a bit with a sense of what this has meant, especially for late successional and old growth forest ecosystems in the Northwest. So a few good things. So one primary accomplishment of the plan was to drastically slow old growth losses from logging. It really did slow them down. According to the 20-year review that was recently done, and if you are interested in finding out more, there's just a treasure trove of information in the 20-year review of the Northwest Forest Plan. And according to that, it showed that, I'm gonna read this to get it right, net changes in the amount of older forests on federal lands managed under the Northwest Forest Plan have been small over the last 20 years. They have lost, there used to be a 2.8 to a 2.9% net decrease. So they're still decreasing, but not as fast as it used to be decreasing. So it's like, is that good? Like, yes, you know, there are still losses in old growth from wildfire, from timber harvest, because remember, they're still logging in old growth, and from insects and disease. But it has slowed down the loss. And the hope is that there are other areas that can, like parts of late successional reserves that weren't already late successional forests, can grow into late successional forests, and that will sometime, at some point, if they stop logging old growth, especially, we will start seeing a net increase annually in the amount of late successional old growth forests. But how about the spotted owls? You know, let's bring it back to them, because as Courtney said, they were the catalyst. And unfortunately, the news here is not good. And it's not just because the Northwest Forest Plan hasn't succeeded the way we wanted it to. The owl is still declining at a rate of 3% per year over its entire range. There are some local populations that are thriving, but really it is not in good shape. And some of the issues are things that were not considered when the Northwest Forest Plan was written. And the two main ones are climate change and barred owls, which are an invasive species. The barred owls, you know, Courtney's Manifest Destiny woman should have a little barred owl flying behind her, because that's what happened. They're originally from the East Coast, and as Western settlement marched across the continent, the barred owls followed. They're opportunistic. They thrive in edge environments like the very fragmented forests that we have, and they, you know, put competitive pressure on the spotted owl, which has a much, much smaller niche of just late successional old growth forests. So that combo of climate change shifting the way the forests are growing, their growth patterns, the recurrence of fire, what grows back after a fire, and the barred owls, as well as habitat loss from continued old growth logging, means the owl is still in decline. many people think that we need to up its protection. In not the timber industry, unfortunately, they just brought another lawsuit to decrease the amount of critical habitat for the owl, but that's another story. I want to stop, just kind of wrap up so we can have more robust discussion about this and I can answer any questions. I think the things I want to leave you with, though, are that the Northwest Forest Plan was revolutionary in that it looked at this ecosystem, took an ecosystem approach and created the reserves and really thought about how species moved through the ecosystem, what they needed, how riparian and terrestrial ecosystems interacted with each other. All of that transformed the way the land management agencies moved forward. The big problem, though, is that those internal pressures of the way that the Forest Service was created to benefit the timber industry. In 1905, its very first book, called the Use Book, focused on providing the most timber. It was providing timber, water for irrigators, and putting out fires. That's like baked into the Forest Service DNA, right? So there are all these external pressures on the agency to not do the right thing, to not follow the Northwest Forest Plan as written, to resist it. And then, of course, there are people in the agency who have heartily embraced it and who love the ecosystem approach, especially people in hydrology and wildlife biology. But it's like we have to be constantly vigilant to more attacks, both direct attacks, like we saw in the Bush years, and now more indirect attacks where they just change the language but do the same thing and make us feel kind of crazy. Because they're like, why do you keep fighting our restoration projects? They're not restoration. So because exploiting the environment for capital gain is baked into our system, like Courtney said, even changing the laws is not enough. You know, there is a cultural element that we need to change in order to really see things shift. And that's one of the things BARC is really out to do, is not just focus on land and policy, but focus on how can we start to see ourselves in the land differently? How can we re-envision culture so we are a part of the land and not just taking from it what we can get? So until we do that, I can't say that the Northwest Forest Plan will be successful, because it again needs to be embedded in a social movement. A social movement got it there in the first place and has kept it going. But we need to continue to change culture through those movements and get to a place where we don't have to be so vigilant and fight, because of course we're going to manage the forest for the most threatened species. And I'm hoping that day will come soon. So with that, I want to pass it back to Courtney, I think has some questions. Oh gosh, I didn't even talk about fire. There's lots of fire. I've been talking about it all the time. And we can get into it if you want. I'm a little fired out right now, but I wanted to leave you some love. So it has been a hard time. This has been a hard year, and the world loves us and is waiting for us to remember that. So with that, I want to pass it to Courtney to take us wherever you want us to go.
We're gonna go to the next slide. And thank you.
The next slide. Boom.
Oh, wait, no. I updated it. Refresh, hit refresh.
Before we move on to that, there's a quick question in the chat. Brenna, if you could touch on the pending / upcoming revision of the Northwest Forest Plan.
Oh, yes. And here we go. That Courtney has a slide just for that. Here we go. So there's in fits and starts, the Forest Service has been talking about revising the Northwest Forest Plan. It was gathering a lot of momentum under the Obama administration, and then kind of happily, the Trump administration didn't move forward with it. They focused on gutting NEPA through a lot of regulatory rules. But this, Courtney, do you want to speak to this cool slide that you just put up and show us where we're at now in the revision process?
We are in this first blue bubble, basically. They are producing various scientific documentation of the conditions lots of things Brenna talked about. How are the various strategies working? What have been the outcomes? What is the status of the owl? What has the impact been on the various species that rely on the old growth habitat? And that information is public. There's here, I'll throw a link in the chat where you can get those documents. The rest of this, I mean, it says it's about a 3-year process or something to get a new plan written and then like approved, I guess, or implemented. But we haven't seen the Forest Service actually describe to us when any of the rest of the steps will start. So it's quite up in the air.
The Bioregional Assessment.
Yeah, so here in the chat is a link to well, if I can I will put it there, to the Forest Service website that has this document called the Bioregional Assessment. And it's not letting me put it in the chat. I'll get it at some point. And feel free to like start doing the research and getting familiar with these documents. Every environmental organization, especially organizations working on forest or public lands, are going to be calling upon the public when this process starts to move, because since it is likely to have significant environmental impacts, changing the Northwest Forest Plan is likely to have significant environmental impacts. So the National Environmental Policy Act is in effect, which means the public is given access to the information and given a role in the decision making and in the feedback loop around decision making, so long as the Trump administration's challenges to NEPA get shut down in court. If the Trump administration's challenges to NEPA stand, if they remain, if they become real, then I think we're just in a completely different universe. We've just like crossed a boundary of dimensions, and I don't honestly know what that does to forest planning. I don't even know if they are required to do forest planning if NEPA goes away. So Brenna, maybe you can scare us a little bit more about protecting NEPA. But every forest organization you'll know will be letting you, and if you're a member of ours or anyone else's, letting you know when there is a public comment period about the revision process. Could be early next year, couldn't be maybe for years from now. It's very up in the air.
There was a question about the revision process. Samantha asked who specifically is charged with doing the research and assessment during this stage, and what are their incentives?
It's mostly Forest Service staff. Yeah, like from the research stations and other staff. So their incentive is their job, but you know, it's internal things. A lot of people did an external review of the biological assessment, and they were not happy with what was there. Like there were only 2 sentences on climate change and carbon storage in it. So hopefully there will be more eyes on the documents before they get finalized.
So we have about 20 minutes. Let's chat. These are some questions that I thought up. Not that we have to like go through and answer them, but maybe I'm trying to like combine the context that I presented with the current situation with this plan that doesn't work as well as it should. And the fact that since it is hopefully going to be revised in a timely manner, there's an opportunity to deal with its ineffectiveness, but let's not get stuck in the same cycles of rationale that we have been using for the last 200 years, because that's like a Sisyphean loop there. You can't have a functioning ecosystem and protect all the species and have extraction economy to provide the nation for its, you know, its destiny of being this like rich and powerful country. That's what the kind of stuff I think about. So
Well, one thing I'm curious about is like the definition of functioning ecosystem, and kind of as you guys were getting at, like the ecosystems which existed when white settlers got here were not without humans. And so it seems like humans are often left out of thinking about ecosystems. I don't know if that is true or not, but yeah, I'm wondering if there, are any, I don't know, mentions of indigenous knowledge or indigenous nations like being involved in the management of land. I don't know.
I mean, I think for what the way I understand it is, as to the degree that any particular tribe wants to be involved, they can like get really aggressive and like make the government engage with them. And the government is like supposed to be responsive to that. But the government isn't going out of its way to engage tribes in a good way, because it's got the barest minimum requirement for engagement. So addressing, what is the expectation for the federal land management agencies? Is it like shoot them a text message to let them know what's going on, or is it like don't do anything unless you get complete buy-in from tribes? And it's that's a broad spectrum that it really depends on, again, what these values are going to be. Is it going to be about maintaining access for the dominant cultural and economic values, or is it going to be about something else? And kind of how do we get there? What do other people think about that question?
I'll just say the thing that came to my mind, it's slightly off topic, but it made me think about the Wilderness Act, where baked into the Wilderness Act, it says wilderness is a place where man is a visitor and does not stay.
So literally excluding people legally. Yeah.
Yeah, it excludes the idea of human involvement.
Another kind of consideration here is the role of science. Science kind of comes on the scene in the mid 1800s, and now it's it's the validation for everything. If the Forest Service does use science to validate their strategies. The fossil fuel industry uses science to validate the necessity of their existence. We use science to try to show the impact, what the negative impacts of those same things will be. And so I kind of think of science as this like this ulterior ultimate motive, not unlike Manifest Destiny or something, where like everything is driven by this, like, let's adhere ourselves to this framing of how do we determine whether something should be done and how we will do it. Science has a bunch of like a completely different tool set. It's not just a egotistical belief, but at the same time kind of aligning all of our decision making to one value framework hasn't solved the problem of trying to shift the way we treat the land from this extractive model where we're just trying to maximize. This is the idea of ecological forestry, is how can you maximize the amount you can take without going so far as to destroy the integrity of the ecosystem. It's still trying to maximize the amount you can take. So yeah, I'll just throw that out there, see if that jogs any ideas for anyone.
Yeah, in response to Brenna's last comment, I think Barbara asked, what is your view of the role of human involvement?
What's your view, Barbara? We may all have different ones.
Well, I was trying to understand Brianna's comment and a little bit yours too. When you were talking about the Indian, I assume you were talking about Warm Springs and what that involvement, should that be encouraged or not? And I was confused because I would think that would be a vested interest to encourage. And I'm just a little confused by what that meant.
Did you say, Brenna, you had something to say?
Sure. My internet is being real weird, so I apologize if it just got unstable. I apologize if I freeze. But I think the important thing to know is that our ecosystems were completely shaped with indigenous land management. And like the native burning was a really important component of why our forests are the way they are and why they're a little out of whack from right now is because that burning got stopped. So I think that often, like Courtney was saying, our history writes out human involvement. Like when white settlers came, they didn't even have eyes to see that this was a heavily managed landscape. They called it an untamed wilderness. I think I would like us to move forward with the idea that humans can live with the environment and indeed have. Like the Wilderness Act's idea that human presence on a regular basis in the landscape is an inherently bad thing, is totally comes from this colonial romantic idea that the wilderness is wild and devoid of human engagement. It's just simply not true. So that's what I mean. I think that it's really important not to write out the active land management that indigenous people have done on the land for time immemorial.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for clarifying. That was my understanding, but your earlier statement threw me a little bit. That makes sense, what you're just saying.
And what I was saying is that, so there's such a thing as consultation that the federal government is required to do with the tribal governments. But consultation is a very vague concept, and it just doesn't have a lot of strong expectations. It's like, if you had to consult me, does that mean you call me right before you do it just to make me aware? Or does that mean I get veto power and you have to engage me at every step of the way? And so this concept of consultation is out there, and the government relies on that. They say, oh, we do consultation with the tribes. But from what I've found, which is so little that I can't even explain to you what consultation is. It's like this very incredibly vague, I don't know, they send a notification and an invitation like, hey, we're going to do this if you want to talk about it, but we're going to do it if you don't say anything also. Like consultation is not the same as like real approval or permission. And what would it look like to say that the federal government has to get permission from the tribes with a vested interest in the area before they can do something? I mean, we already can't get them, they don't have to get permission from the public, and it's like theoretically public land. So this is a real big step to say that they would have to get permission. But
well, based on historic experience, I can see why the tribes would ignore the consultation without there being any real
right, there's not a lot of trust there.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
There's not a lot of trust, and there's not really a lot of consultation like offered. It's a very much like a lip service level. So but at the same time, other tribes are really take that consultation concept and they work it as hard as they can, and they have to get they have to have a lot of resources. They have to have people with the experience in interacting with this big bureaucracy that is the federal government in order to do that. So it depends from one tribe to the next how much they're able to do that, and like what can we, if we're gonna engage with these management plans that our government is doing, what do we have, how can we impact those plans so that it puts more more responsibility on the government that we have a connection to treat the indigenous governments with more intention, right? And with more, just a higher level of respect. And yeah. Can we do that with the Northwest Forest Plan? Probably. But the thing is, we have to figure out how to put it in through these processes that are already designed around this. All the stuff we've just discussed, this historical stuff, is all the foundation of what everything's, even if you create something new today, it's still based on all of that. So how can we like break into a new mode altogether, new methodology?
Okay, thank you.
Hopefully that has something useful in it.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in what people think about the second question, because I put that in a binary there, but I don't know that it is.
I'm kind of glad actually that you brought that up, because I've been reflecting on it a bit since you posed the question before. That's something I think about a lot when considering what materials I want to use in my own life. And wood is kind of having a moment as a renewable resource, but living in the forest and, you know, just having like an incredible love for trees and wildlife, you just sort of start to see wood as a being. And learning more about forestry and the lumber industry, and just how extractive it is and how unnatural it is. Like if you look at the map of Oregon, and it's just a checkerboard of, you know, these 40-acre, 80-acre plots where they just clear cut the whole thing. And it just sort of, I agree with you in your assessment of it's kind of like a gaslighting feeling, I guess. So they'll use science to justify what they're doing, and then, you know, we'll come back with science on our side. And it just sort of feels like, I think maybe it was Brenna that said something about it being crazy making the way the lumber industry is presenting things now. Like, why are you fighting this restoration project? Just sort of, yeah, it's like this weird manipulation of the language.
Yeah.
I don't know if that adds anything, but that's just sort of what I've been reflecting on.
I've been working on forest issues around Mount Hood since '97, right, for like 23 years. And the very same things that they used to do, and they were like, hey, we're logging and it's got a bad impact on the environment, but we have to do it to get this timber volume. Now they say, we're restoring the overstocked forest by coming in and opening up the canopy to make it more resilient so there's not as much competition. And it's all good, you know? They like no longer admit that they have an adverse impact. So it's not like they changed their behavior, they just changed their brand.
Yeah. And I do remember I did actually have a point when I started. So I you know, when I'm considering what to use in my own life and, you know, looking at using wood and natural materials, once you start to consider that those things actually are extractive as well, you know, it's obviously wood will decompose and those nutrients can go back into the earth rather than, you know, as opposed to plastic or something. But the goal shouldn't necessarily be to use this instead of that. It should be to use less of everything. And that's, I think, where the movement really needs to be, is just away from growth and just sort of like infinite economic prosperity and growth forever for everyone. It's just literally not sustainable at all. And so I think that's where I would like to see the cultural shift, is just away from more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
Well, something that just prompted me to think about was that, I don't know, we very rarely talk about something just having inherent good for itself, you know. So like that a forest is grown either for timber or for recreation or for mental health, like for humans to feel happy in, and there's no like talk of like, can't we just let it grow because that's what it does, it grows. And like, yeah, and like if we want to or feel like we need to use something, that then, you know, that's the question, is like, is it, like, not that this was grown to build houses, but we'd like to build a house, can we take from this thing that already exists or something? Yeah, it is like just like reframing it.
Yeah, I like that. this is this, you know, again with the context, like the context we're in is that it's still the 18th century context. How can we get as much as we possibly can to have this ultimate prosperity that is our destiny as a nation? We're supposed to be this very wealthy place that has all these resources, and we just use them. Like, we're free to use them all. That's still where we're at. Now we just do it scientifically, you know? So how can we, I think some of the things you've just said are like about changing the context that we make these decisions under. And what are our goals? Is our goal to have this maximum prosperity, which obviously isn't equitable. It's not maximum prosperity for everyone. Some people have to literally be forced off the land in order for maximum prosperity to.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, we have prosperity already. Like, the things that exist in the world, in this country, are enough. Like, we have enough to sustain everyone.
Especially if we redistributed some of it.
Oh, yeah. It's shocking.
And it's something like a forest plan that's a regional, you know, geographically it's based on an ecological concept, right? Which is the habitat, the range of the spotted owl, and specifically its old growth needs. How can we work that framework, you know, away from this prosperity destiny complex that we have? And I think this prosperity destiny thing is not only about extraction, it's also about that recreation experience lifestyle kind of thing too. It's not, you know, which is maybe less environmentally like violent, but it's not really a different, philosophically it's not different. It's how much can we benefit? How can we maximize our quality of life, our richness in our life through these activities, these recreation activities, all of it, you know.
Yeah, what's the economic benefit of the recreational industry? It's kind of like, that's the most promising argument, I think, for preservation of natural areas. But that's a really sad fact, I guess, that the natural areas don't have inherent value. It is kind of interesting, though, that the spotted owl seems to have enough inherent value for enough people to fight for it. I guess it's sort of reminiscent of like Save the Whales in the 70s. People got real worked up about whales, and there's so much more than whales and spotted owls that needs protecting. It's like all those tiny little mollusks and things all serve a purpose, as do humans. And it's like, yeah, it's very frustrating to try to convince people that interconnectedness is valuable in itself and just like critical to the survival of us and everything else.
Well, we have reached our time. So obviously there's like a lot to this issue and this discussion, whether it's about the Northwest Forest Plan in particular, or just more broadly about the movement, our conservation or environmental movement. So I hope you all will like carry these thinkings and questions with you and whatever it is, you know, that you're involved in, and come back for more at different BARC events. Yeah, Brenna, do you want to say anything in closing?
I think I look forward to continuing this conversation when we can be in person around a campfire again. It seems like one of the things at base camp that we could talk late into the night about the underlying philosophies of how we got here and whether or not it's possible to move into a meaningful place without disrupting those philosophies. So I really want to thank you, Courtney, for bringing that in. As you said, you think way too much, but we all get to benefit from that. And you know, at some point, hopefully we'll be able to do this in person again and like just harvest the richness from being together. But I want to appreciate everyone for coming out on this blessedly glorious rainy night. and so happy to have the reins back and sharing with us. And please feel free as always to contact us. Email works best because we're not really in the office anymore. But I know Courtney and I love to have conversations about this, and can get in more in detail on this if you'd like to. And Courtney, do you want to pitch? We've got one more webinar coming up. The Courtney and Brenna Show has a reprise.
Yes, so I pulled up our events page on our website here for the next handful of events. The Mount Hood and Climate Change Ecology and Policy event is the next Brenna and Courtney show. Basically, the Forest Service knows about climate change. They've done their own research and analysis on the projected impact of climate change for Mount Hood in particular, but they are just kind of sitting on that information and they're not doing anything with it. And so we have, it's a public document, the draft of their climate vulnerability assessment from Mount Hood.
Public-ish. You can't
Public-ish,
anywhere, but we got our hands on it.
and we're gonna tell you all about what they know and what they should do and what they don't seem to want to do about climate change. And then these other things, the Free Mount Hood campaign to update Mount Hood's forest management plan. It's a whole different management plan. Barkabouts are typically hikes. We're doing, we have been doing them virtually. This is a very limited capacity, in-person, socially distanced hike that's not actually in Mount Hood, but somewhere near to Portland. And there'll be more stuff popping up on this page from time to time, so please drop in on the website. If you haven't been here before, you can sign up here to get our email alerts, you can donate, you can read all of our past articles, and you can see about individual timber sales and other projects that we're doing there. So keep in touch and stay well, and thanks again.